All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Diebel. I am the chair of the East Lyme Democratic Town Committee, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to what is our final scheduled community conversation. We've done one of these each month, I think pretty much all year, and this one will be our final one that we have scheduled. We may do another one soon, but as municipal elections kind of heat up, we have to put our energy and ideas elsewhere. So just before we begin, I just want to remind you that if your microphone is not muted, we can hear everything going on in your home. And if you have your camera on, we can also see the space behind you. So it's just something to keep in mind. This evening, we have a presentation on gun violence prevention. We have the chapter leader of the Connecticut chapter of Moms Demand Action, Kate Roschmann, is going to be with us. We also have Jonathan Perloe of Connecticut Against Gun Violence. And we also have Christine Stahl, who is an East Lyme DTC member and also a member of Moms Demand Action. So she wears multiple hats, and we're really happy to have these three friends join us this evening. So before I step out of the way and let them really talk about the stuff they know, I would just like to say that even though this is our final community conversation that we have scheduled, there is another interesting opportunity coming up in July. On July 12th, the Ledyard DTC is going to present Professor Sarah Bronin, who's going to talk about HB 6107, which seeks to establish equity in zoning laws around the state, which is certainly going to be an issue in the upcoming municipal election, and just generally something all of us should know about as Connecticut residents. So if you are interested in that, you can reach out to the Ledyard DTC. Once again, that is on July 12th. I'll make a little plug for that at the end too. And without much further ado, I'm just going to hand this over to start with Christine Stahl. She's kind of our moderator for this evening. So Christine, if you don't mind, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Jason. And thanks again, Kate and Jonathan, for chatting with us tonight. So just to get right into it, according to the Center for Disease Control, nearly 40,000 people die each year by guns in the United States at a cost of $280 billion in medical care, criminal justice services, lost revenue and productivity, lost income, and quality of life costs that are associated with pain and suffering. And yet there has been no political will to pass meaningful federal gun reform laws in decades, leaving it up to states and organizations like yours. So Kate, can we just start with you, and can you tell us a little bit about Moms Demand Action and what drew you personally into the movement?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. So as Jason said, I'm the chapter leader for the Connecticut chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. We're a grassroots movement, all volunteers of Americans working together to decrease gun violence and increase public safety across our nation. We're gun violence survivors, including victims and witnesses, change makers and advocates who come together in partnership to work toward a future that's free from gun violence. And that work takes a lot of different forms. We're raising awareness about gun violence, advocating for gun sense legislation, campaigning for candidates who support gun violence prevention policies at the national, state, and local level, and supporting community-based organizations. Personally, I joined Moms Demand Action after the shooting in Parkland, Florida. It was that school shooting and my fear for my own children that spurred me to action. It was only after joining Moms Demand Action that I understood that for many mothers, that fear for their children and that risk of gun violence is something they deal with on a daily basis. And I couldn't ignore it or hide in my bubble anymore. So I committed myself to the gun violence prevention movement, and I've been a volunteer leader with Moms Demand Action ever since. Here in Connecticut, we have done a lot of work advocating for gun sense legislation, and I know Jonathan's going to be talking more about a lot of that legislation later. But one of those main bills is the modernization of ERPO, which are extreme risk protective order, to help people in a crisis and help empower families to help their loved ones in a crisis. And then another one was the HB 5677, which directed Connecticut's Medicaid program to fund hospital-based violence intervention programs and other community violence intervention services for victims of violence who are at risk for violent re-injury or retaliation. And when you talk about those costs of gun violence in Connecticut, it costs our state $1.4 billion every year. And over $60 million is paid by taxpayers. And that's not counting that collective trauma in our communities. And that's one of the reasons why those programs are so important and mean so much to us.
Thanks, Kate. And I always enjoy working with you. Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about Connecticut Against Gun Violence, what the mission is, and how and when you got involved?
Sure. Thank you also for inviting us here today. It's a topic I enjoy talking about. So Connecticut Against Gun Violence was founded almost 30 years ago. It was in 1993. And it was actually after an incident in Bridgeport where I think it was a kindergarten student was accidentally shot and killed on a bus. And some women in Bridgeport and Fairfield County just felt something needed to be done. So they came together and formed, I believe the first iteration, the name was the Connecticut Coalition Against Gun Violence. And that was the seeds of CAGV. Several years later, about 4 or 5 years later, they hired an executive director. And so it became a sort of professionalized staff in the sense that there was paid staff. But we, and when I say we, it's really we and our supporters, because my feeling is advocacy organizations don't really accomplish anything on their own. We help direct and funnel energy and people's voices to drive change. So CAGV and its supporters, which may be members of CAGV or Moms Demand Action or others, we look all over for support. Have driven most of the strong gun laws that Connecticut enjoys now. And so some of those this group of women, their first task was to get Connecticut to pass an assault weapons ban, which they did in 1994. And that was that's when the federal bill went into effect, but then it expired 10 years later. And we've pushed for permit to purchase laws, universal background checks. The past couple of years, we strengthened our safe storage laws. Ethan's law was, again, driven by a survivor, but with our assistance in terms of actually seeing it through the legislative process. In terms of what got me involved, a little like Kate, it was a horrible mass shooting. In this case, it was Sandy Hook. And I just kind of felt the need to do something. And the way I got sort of involved was there was a local group. I live in Greenwich, and there was a local group that started, it was Greenwich Council Against Gun Violence. And we just started doing things locally. We got our first selectmen to join Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and we did other things. And I realized as individuals, we actually do have a lot of power. And we can drive change. And so I got kind of more and more involved and met people at CAGV and joined their board in, I guess it was 2014. And then in beginning of 2017, I made a big career switch. My background was in communications and advertising. I left that job and joined as communications director for CAGV, which is where I've been for the past 5 or so years. And it's been enormously rewarding to be part of the change that we're driving.
That's great. Thank you for all your work. You mentioned Connecticut. We're really a leader in gun violence prevention laws. I know that I'm not sure exactly where we stack up with the other states. Maybe one of you do have that on the tip of your tongue, but yeah, go ahead.
So we're actually here. I'll really quickly share this slide, which shows where we stack up and why it's so important. So this is published by Giffords, who they rate states on the strength of their gun laws every year. And for the last 8 years, we've been in the top 3. We are currently number 3. And the way this chart is ordered from left to right, it's in order of the strength of the state's gun laws. And then the bars themselves are showing the gun death rates in those states. and Connecticut enjoys the 6th lowest gun death rate in the country. And you can pretty easily tell that states on the left that have strong gun laws tend to have lower gun death rates, and states on the right that have very weak gun laws tend to have much higher rates of gun death. So we do very well in both measures.
Can I give one of you guys a chance just to, for people listening that aren't as familiar with the movement, to talk about, obviously it's the mass shootings that make the headlines, but when we're talking about gun violence, there's a whole scope of areas that we're focused on. So could you just kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah. Kate, do you want to do that? And then I'll kind of, I'll do a little deeper dive on community gun violence, which I'm sure Kate will mention.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, just a quick breakdown, mass shootings, especially things like Sandy Hook and Parkland, that definitely get the headlines. That's a very small percentage of gun violence in America. Usually between 60 and 66% of gun violence is suicide. And then the other huge chunk is gun homicides. And most of those gun homicides occur in cities. In fact, most of those, even within that, occur within 4% of blocks. There's a very small amount of neighborhoods that account for most gun violence. And that's where we're seeing that, that collective trauma within those communities. Jonathan, do you want to go on about that?
Yeah. Kate is exactly right in terms of the concentration of gun violence. And so these are just some statistics from Connecticut. So on the previous slide, we have the 6th lowest rate of gun deaths in the nation, but we really do have a crisis in Connecticut around community gun violence or urban gun violence. The number overall of gun homicides last year at 105 was about the same as it was 10 years ago in Connecticut. In our 3 largest cities, Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, account for more than half the statewide total. But interestingly, last year, there were really sharp increases in smaller cities. So like Waterbury in particular, it typically does not have very many gun homicides, but last year, while the total number was about 10 or 11, so it's not huge, but it was 3 times higher than it was in previous years. And as Kate mentioned, these homicides are occurring in urban communities, lower income communities, and the victims are disproportionately people of color. And so in Connecticut, more than half of the gun homicide victims are Black, yet only 10% of the population is Black. And the statistic that just really jumps out to me are that young Black men in Connecticut are nearly 40 times more likely to be murdered with a gun than a young white man. And so that really, kind of puts the issue into perspective. If you want, Christine, I can kind of go ahead and talk about some of the things that we're doing on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can do that, and then we can come back and ask questions and whatnot. There actually is some good news this year. I'd say actually has been very positive in terms of feeling like some things are going to happen. One of the things when I talked about CAGB being around for nearly 30 years, most of that time has been working on strengthening our gun laws. But we, over the past few years, have come to the realization that while strong gun laws are critical and they prevent community gun violence and gun suicide and unintentional shootings, particularly with respect to urban gun violence, it's not enough. And so we really have to focus on other things. And those things are about spending money on programs that can prevent community gun violence. So the news coming out of Washington is very positive. In the American Jobs Plan, which has not passed, so this is proposed, President Biden has identified $5 billion to be spent over 8 years focused on community gun violence prevention programs. Kate talked about a bill that passed this year about allowing Medicaid funds to be used to pay for services to help victims or people at risk of gun violence, and so that's the Medicaid reimbursement. The White House put out some guidance on, there's actually 26 existing grant programs that they're sort of advising, I guess, the administrators of those programs to really focus in on using the grants that are being made to focus on community gun violence prevention. So there's like there is money in the system, but it's not always being directed to community gun violence prevention. And then lastly, they put in a spending request for $200 million in the fiscal 2022 budget request. And some of that is coming from these grant programs. Here in, here in Connecticut, we have been talking about this for a while, but in particularly, we really kind of started stepping up this discussion in the beginning of 2020, and that was going to be our legislative priority in 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic came along. Some of you may have heard about the death of a 3-year-old in essentially a drive-by shooting. He was sitting in the back seat with his siblings, and that sadly, sort of as mass shootings do, really got the attention of legislators. Senator Moore in particular, who represents Bridgeport, has really just sort of like, it really shook her deeply. So there's been a lot of discussion about the need to do more. The other thing coming from the Biden administration is that in the American Rescue Plan, and so that was the stimulus plan that did pass, there's, I think, about $1.2 billion coming to Connecticut over the next 3 years. And Governor Lamont has proposed spending money from that on community gun violence prevention programs. And the legislature actually stepped up and they wanted to spend $50 million. There's money that has been put in the bond bill, about $12 million. But here's kind of the problem that we face is the state doesn't really have any infrastructure to do a better job of getting this money. And so a lot of it, you have to apply for grants from the federal government, and we don't have an intentional way of essentially giving out grants to programs that need them. Most of the state level spending has been to the Project Longevity program, which operates in Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven. And it is a proven model at community gun violence prevention, but it is only one of a number of different models. And so there's nobody in the state who's really looking at what are the needs of communities, where can we get money, what are the right types of programs, how do we, like, for example, in Waterbury, there is no Project Longevity. How do we jumpstart a program like that, or hospital-based violence intervention programs? So we came up with this concept of the Connecticut Initiative to Prevent Community Gun Violence. And it really is about establishing an Office of Community Gun Violence Prevention. And, it doesn't really matter what it's called, but the idea is it is an ongoing effort that is staffed with state employees who are looking at needs, making grants, helping communities develop these programs. So we've been working at this for over a year now. We're really getting a lot of support across the state. We've signed up 36 partners, really to kind of help us just get the word out and show that there is broad-based support for this. During the election last year, in our grade, we have candidates running for the legislature complete a form so that we can grade them. And one of the questions was, if elected, would you support the Connecticut Initiative? And 70 of the legislators who completed the survey and were elected said yes. And since it's almost exactly about a year that we have actually started explicitly asking our supporters to contact their legislators and Governor Lamont to essentially establish the Connecticut Initiative or do something of that sort. And so far we've had, well over 1,000 citizens have written their legislators. And so Governor Lamont alone has gotten almost 1,000 emails. And then just for Wear Orange 2 weeks ago, we started a new sort of call to action where we're asking people to write notes to Governor Lamont, and we're kind of moving those on, transcribing them onto postcards. And so far we've sent we've collected 200 of them. So we just need to keep kind of talking about it. I don't have to go over this stuff. So that's sort of what we've been doing on the community gun violence prevention front. And when the next thing that I can talk about when we're ready is sort of going through the number of bills that have passed, and Kate mentioned a number of them.
Well, getting back to we talked about the pandemic, and there was some confusion about this kind of the sense of, well, everyone's home, so we don't see the mass shootings hitting the media. What actually happened is gun sales, we know, went up dramatically, and gun deaths were at an all-time high. And a lot of that, whether it was, social or economic struggles, from the pandemic, we saw, people in their house together, stuck together. So domestic violence went up, suicide went up. So I'm hoping that we can talk about that specifically. On domestic violence, on average, 57 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner every month. We have close to 1 million women alive today who have reported being shot, and 4.5 million who have reported being threatened by an intimate partner. And so we're constantly working on, the laws that can help those women. The IRPA law is helpful. We're all, and then of course we're trying to tackle the boyfriend loophole, the Charleston loophole. We've made progress in the state. I'm hoping that you can talk specifically, even in, as it relates to the legislation we've passed in the last couple of years, how that has helped both with domestic violence. And then I'd also like to talk a little bit about suicide a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah, if I could take this really.
Go ahead, Kate. Yep.
So in 2020, gun sales just in Connecticut went up like 33% from the year before, which is huge, especially when we know that having a gun in the home makes you more likely to die by that gun, whether it's by suicide or homicide. The presence of a gun, access to a gun, makes a woman 5 times more likely to be killed by her abuser. And we know that gun violence and domestic violence are inextricably linked. We can't separate them. Another bill that went through the legislature that didn't mention guns but was important was adding coercion and control to the definition of domestic violence, because a lot of times if a woman is threatened with a gun, if there's a gun on the bedside and she knows that is a measure of control, but it's not illegal. Now that is something where a woman can get, and I say women because generally victims are women, although of course victims of domestic violence can be men. But a victim of domestic violence can then use evidence of coercive control that's not physically violent in order to get protective orders and things like that. And that's incredibly important.
Yeah, I was listened to the public hearing for that bill, Jennifer's Law, and actually testified. And some of this, as being in this area, you hear some pretty heart-wrenching stories, but the ones that the testimony from some of the survivors was just it brought tears to my eyes, put it that way. One of the things that Connecticut did in 2015 was, at the time, if you got a restraining order, the subject was prohibited from possessing firearms. But when you got the temporary restraining order, which is usually the way it starts, that was not the case. And so for that 10 to 14 day period when you have an ex parte order, so it's a temporary order before the hearing is held to see if the order is going to be made permanent, the abuser was allowed to keep his firearms if he had them, or he could actually go and buy a firearm. And there was a woman, Lori Jackson, who was killed by her estranged husband the day before they were going to have the hearing to see if the order would be made permanent. And since the time at which a woman, and usually as a woman, decides to leave an abusive relationship, that is the most dangerous time, because essentially they are kind of breaking free of the control that the abuser is trying to exert on them. And so it really made no sense that you would allow somebody to continue to own firearms, given the statistics that Kate mentioned about the danger, the substantially increased danger when firearms are present. So we closed that loophole in 2015. There is a bill pending in the US Senate, sponsored by Senator Blumenthal, which is trying to do the same thing. And in Connecticut, we're very fortunate to have like probably the most amazing congressional delegation. I mean, not only is it sort of essentially a given that they would vote for any stronger gun regulation, but they have been incredible leaders on the issue. I mean, just amazing. And they are always present. So if we need them to help us with something, and they really help with the state level legislation as well. So really the only thing we can do there is if you have friends or family in conservative states, get them to write their senators and tell them to support stronger federal gun laws.
We also updated the extreme risk protection order this year, and I think one piece of note with that law, is that a family member can now petition the court directly, which I think is really important in highlighting, the concern over suicide, because you don't always necessarily want to involve law enforcement. So if medical professionals and family members can go to the court directly, petition the court directly, we might be saving some lives that way. Specifically when it comes to suicide, I'm going to toss this one to Kate regarding veteran suicide. The Department of Defense in 2020, their annual suicide report found that there were 498 suicide deaths among service members. And this was for the year 2019. And 64% involved a firearm. So while veterans make up 7% of the US adult population, they account for 18% of the nation's gun suicide deaths, which is, it's interesting because obviously, veterans are very familiar with how to use a weapon. And so they're a population that we need to consider just because they're trained. And we hear a lot about, well, if you're trained, if you know how to use a weapon, if you respect a weapon, and that really is not giving the focus on this issue of what leads people to desperate measures. So Kate, with your ties to the military, you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, just to explain, my husband's active duty Navy. We're stationed at Sub Base New London, and I think most people who are connected to the military know someone who has died by gun suicide. The dynamics of suicide are complex, involving factors like poverty and unemployment, substance abuse, and mental illness, and it's not different for veterans. A lot of times, the risk of veteran suicide is higher in the first year after they separate from the military. A lot of that is because of kind of the loss of mission and that loss of community. A lot of times being in the military, it's our whole culture. It's almost more than a community, and when you separate, you lose that. And so there's an extra element that makes all of those factors worse. And then on top of that, veterans are much more likely to own guns than the rest of the population. So suicide had been deadlier for veterans and military than combat has in the last 15 years. Wow. And somewhere between 60 and 70% of veteran suicides are by gun. One thing that I think that this modernized ERPO law can help with is, as people are able to directly petition the courts, allows them to bypass law enforcement, that lets them help bypass a little bit of the stigma, because there's the stigma of mental illness, and then there's the culture within the military and within veterans of, I'm going to push past the pain and I don't need help. I'm going to suck it up and I'm going to deal with this because that's what I need to do. That's my mission. Push through it. Never ask for help. And that makes it a lot harder. And it becomes a big deterrent to seeking help in any kind of mental health crisis. And then for families, there's a lot of shame around that as well. So if we can stop people from having to now I have to go to my local police, if you can cut that out and we just petition the courts, then it can allow more people to help their family members in crisis. So there's a website, it's onethingtodo.org, where people can plug in their state and see where they can go. And I know many people in military community have offered that as a resource to people for not just military and veterans, but also for military family members who are suffering.
one of the things when we were starting to, or when I was starting to look at this a few years ago, what's surprising is how few people, particularly among mental health professionals, are aware of our ERPO law. And so one of the things that we need to do is just make sure that people are aware. And this, in a sense, the awareness needs to be of not gun owners, but of the people, their family members and friends, because ERPOs are really a last resort measure for trying to remove the guns, when it's certainly preferable if somebody voluntarily relinquishes possession of the gun. The other thing that the bill does, and I want to just clarify one part. So the bill that passed, it allows family members and medical professionals to initiate the process, but law enforcement will still get involved. And there was kind of like some back and forth about the process, and there was some of the opposition was they felt like, why were law enforcement being cut out, which really wasn't the case. But so what will happen is the person will go to the court, they'll fill out a petition, and if the court feels the person has a good faith belief that somebody is at risk, then they will order the police to conduct an investigation to see if if there is imminent risk. The other case or the other kind of two situations where that's helpful is around mental health. There clearly is the stigma, and then there's other communities of color that are a little distrustful of police, and so this also opens an avenue for them. And there has been at least one case that's received a fair amount of publicity, I don't want to say publicity, but coverage, where it was felt that the police weren't being responsive enough. And so if you go to the police and say, I'm really worried about somebody, and you don't feel like they're taking you seriously, again, you have this other avenue. But the other thing that the bill did, which again kind of puts Connecticut out in front of other states, is the way the process worked. It was kind of like getting a protective order. You go, and if the court believes that there is a risk of imminent harm, they will issue an ex parte order, and then there's a hearing to see if the order, the gun removal, will be made permanent. And by permanent, it's for up to a year. But when the order expires, the gun owner can just go and get their guns back. And we felt that it kind of makes sense to make sure that the person is no longer at risk of imminent harm to themselves or others. And the good thing is, a lot of times when ERPOs are issued, that actually does result in the person getting the health, the services, the behavioral health services they need, or whatever the other things are. But we would like to be sure that that person is no longer at risk of violence. And so now there will be a court hearing, and it is incumbent on the state to demonstrate that there's still a risk. So it's the onus is on the state, but there is now a sort of an affirmative opportunity to make sure that there's no longer a risk before the guns are returned. And Connecticut, as far as we know, may be the only state that actually mandates that now.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but we also added a which should have been, I think, a no-brainer, that if you are deemed to be an imminent threat and your guns are taken away from you temporarily, you can't get more guns in the meantime while you're waiting, which was actually something that could happen.
Yeah, that, and also, let's say you come home and you tell your spouse, like, I lost my job, life isn't worth living, I'm gonna get a gun and kill myself. Even if you don't, so currently the way it works is there has to be a reasonable belief that the person possesses a gun to issue the risk warrant. But now under the new law, the person doesn't have to own a gun. And in Connecticut, if you've never owned a gun, it actually takes a fair amount of time to get a gun. But there are people who might have a permit who just, for whatever reason, don't currently possess a gun, and they literally could go out and get a gun that day if they have a valid permit. So this would prevent that from happening. Yeah.
So we've talked about city gun violence, domestic violence, suicide. I'm blanking on some other things, but I would feel remiss if we didn't. It's not a huge portion of gun violence, but unintentional shootings. We passed, I forget which year was it, 2018 or 2019.
19,
we passed the secure storage of firearms, both in the home and in a vehicle. And I think everyone, our hearts are always with the Song family. Their son, Ethan Song, lost his life when he was unintentionally, he was playing at a friend's house with an unsecured weapon and unintentionally shot himself. It's tragic. And every time I hear the Song speak, it's just amazing to me where they get their strength. And quite frankly, as being a volunteer in this movement, it always feels awkward to have a parent who lost a child or a spouse or whomever say, "Oh, thank you for being here." Because I want to say to them, "Oh my gosh, you shouldn't have to be here." Like, you've already lost a loved one and you're fighting for all the rest of us. And I just wish more people would hear that and realize that it's on all of us, to pick up the torch and to do more, because we don't want that to happen to us as well. But anyway, back to unintentional shootings. In the safe storage laws, there's training that, I think, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe, was it an education piece that passed in Ethan's law that may be working its way down, once it goes through the state boards of ed, getting down and hitting us at the municipal level at some point. Do we know, because like, for example, Moms Demand Action has its own training called Be Smart, and it's really geared not towards the children. We're not teaching children how to safely, this isn't the Boy Scouts or whatever, I don't know what scouting groups use guns, or the hunting club. This is really talking to parents and caregivers about keeping your guns safely stored and modeling good behavior so that children don't have access to this stuff. Where are we in terms of education? How are you guys thinking about this? Do you know of any legislation that's going to be coming down?
Jonathan, do you know about the legislation piece of this?
I can talk about what Christine has mentioned. Why don't you talk about Be Smart, because that is a...
Yeah, so Be Smart is it's a program that, just like Christine said, Eddie Eagle is the NRA's program that teaches kids not to touch guns. The problem is that if you teach a 10-year-old not to touch a gun, they'll listen, they'll hear you, but if they see a gun, their brains can't control themselves. I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I would never want them to be anywhere near an unsecured gun, because no matter what I tell them, they won't do what I say. And that has tragic consequences. And so often what happens is not that people don't care. It's that they don't realize the risk, and they don't realize how easy it is to solve the risk. A lot of gun safes are wildly expensive and they are effective, but that's not necessary to secure a gun. There are other much less expensive ways to secure guns. And we need to make sure that people are aware both how important it is and how easy it is to safely secure your guns, both because kids can accidentally find them and unintentionally discharge them, wounding or killing themselves or others, but also because child and adolescent suicide is impulsive and tragic, and no child should have access to a gun. Ever.
Yeah, so this was, I think, perhaps well-intentioned, and part of it was there's always sort of a desire in the Judiciary Committee to sort of give the opponents of gun laws like something. We were not happy with that aspect of the bill, because unlike what Kate was saying, this is not about educating adults. This is about educating kids. And so the law, part of Ethan's law, mandated that I'll back up a second. There was a law passed a long time ago. It was like 10 years ago. I'm not sure which law it was exactly. And it included language that said the Department of Education may create a curriculum about safe storage, or about gun safety, not safe storage. And the opponents of stronger gun laws in Connecticut were really quite upset that the Department of Public Health never did that. So in Ethan's law, they turned it from may create a curriculum guide to shall. Now, the guide is just a guide, so no school district is mandated to teach it, But we took a look at the guide that was published, and it is appalling. First of all, the American Academy of Pediatrics, their recommendation is don't have guns in the home. So the idea that we're sort of normalizing the, that it is okay to have guns in the home. I mean, yes, it is your constitutional right. And if you want to do that, that is okay. But guns in the home do not make you safer. And telling kids about guns in the home is, quite honestly, as Kate said, there is no evidence that suggests that any of these curriculum make kids safer, and there's definitely evidence that suggests just the opposite. The other thing is and I read this proposed curriculum guide, it went way beyond gun safety and safe storage. It was about how to respect the rights of gun owners, and it was really. And so we lodged our dissatisfaction with that curriculum guide. It's a little unclear what's happening with it right now, but it really was. It was just went so far beyond gun safety in terms of safe storage, and what kids should do if they do encounter a gun. And quite honestly, when we talk about the fact that gun violence costs state taxpayers, I think it's $90 million. It's either 60 or $90 million. And we can't get enough money to fund programs like Project Longevity that are proven to save lives. Yet we have state employees spending their time writing curriculum guides. You can tell how I feel about this. So, but what Kate was talking about in terms of educating adults makes a ton of sense. And yeah, so we totally agree with that. And we worked on trying to publish a brochure on ERPO that we're trying to kind of distribute in the same way to really raise people's awareness.
Well, I think we're coming up towards the end of the hour. Are there any, I think it's a good time to see if there are any questions or any clarifications by our guests. Yes, Jason.
So I understand that there is very little action on the federal level in terms of gun violence prevention, but that states have been successful, more successful when it's advanced at the state level. And I've heard that ballot initiatives have been very successful. Can you guys talk about the breakdown of maybe those three different levels of successes that we've had in recent years, or just what's on the docket going forward, I guess?
It's interesting. So Connecticut doesn't have a ballot initiative process. And I have to say, as a legislative advocacy person, that's actually good because ballot initiatives are hugely expensive. And so I think, and I work on election reform, voting rights stuff in my, as Jason knows, and just looking at what it takes to like do ballot initiatives is very difficult. It's interesting. I'm not aware of, I guess actually in Vermont, I think they might have advanced their ERPO bill through a ballot initiative. I'm not positive, but I think that might be the case. But you are right that the action is at the state level because the federal government has largely ceded its authority. The problem is, unlike some other rights or things that we can protect at the state level, guns don't respect borders. And so while clearly a state having stronger gun laws does help keep it safer, it can't keep it's hard to keep guns out. And so like half of the guns recovered in crimes in Connecticut come from out of state, and of those that come from out of state, the vast majority come from states with weak gun laws. And when you hear like people always talk about, well, Illinois has strong gun laws, but look how many people get killed in Chicago. Well, it's because they live right next to Indiana. So we have to do what we can at the state level, because unfortunately right now that's sort of the only game in town. And I just heard, I guess the end of last week, it seemed like some of the discussions with Senator Murphy and the Republican caucus around like the background check bill had fallen apart. And it really is, it's kind of interesting, the intersection of voting and election with gun violence prevention, because one of the reasons that there's this huge disparity where a majority of Americans are in favor of, not only background checks, but assault weapons ban, a permit to purchase. And the reason they're not getting passed at the federal level is because gerrymandering is probably the single biggest issue. So the Congress just is not representative of its constituents. So just wanted to, so we talked about a number of the bills that had passed. The one other really important, well, there's actually two other important bills, but one that's really important was SB 1. And that was the bill that declares racism to be a public health crisis and does a lot of things to try to increase equity in the provision of both physical and behavioral health. But in that bill, there was a provision that essentially is going to begin the process of making this Connecticut initiative that I talked about a reality. So one of the parts of the bill was setting up a advisory committee to the state legislature to advise it on creating a commission on gun violence intervention and prevention. And if you kind of look at the description of what that commission is supposed to do, it is essentially exactly what we are proposing with the Connecticut initiative. And I'll kind of circle back to the reason we succeed is because we get citizens involved in the process. And it certainly is the case that while other things have intervened and sort of brought the issue to the fore, the fact that we have been, talking about this for over a year really, I think, kind of helped it become a reality. That said, it's an advisory committee to advise the legislature on setting up a commission, which is not quite the same thing as actually just doing it. And we are continuing to push Governor Lamont to basically just do it. We don't have to wait for the legislature to kind of establish this capability.
In Moms Demand Action, the founder, Shannon Watts, always reminds us that it's a marathon, not a sprint to end gun violence. And I think we just, there are so many things to chip away at. And I just appreciate everyone's efforts in it. But before we forget, where can everyone find you if they want to get involved with each of your organizations? How do we find you?
So with Moms Demand Action, you can text the word READY to 64433. So READY to 64433. And that's how you can connect with us, or you can go to momsdemandaction.org.
And for us, you can go to cagv.org/join us. And that would get, to sign up for our email list. And then let me see if I have it here. If you want to, where was it? Let me get you this link. So if you would like to write a note to Governor Lamont, both thanking him for passing SB 1 and kind of urging him to do more, I will give you a link in 2 seconds, and that will send you to a form where you can just write a note. And then we have some interns this summer who are madly transcribing everybody's notes onto postcards. So actually, if you have a phone with you, here while I get that, if you have a phone, you can actually scan that, and then I will drop the link in the as soon as I find it. Where is that? I have too many links here.
Did anyone else have any other questions? I feel like we covered a lot of ground. Jason, what do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is probably a good time to end it. So I guess I will start by thanking Kate Roschmann of Moms Demand Action, Jonathan Perloe of Connecticut Against Gun Violence, and of course Christine Stahl of our DTC for doing such a great job. I'm a teacher, I am a parent, and the idea of gun violence really brings a lot of anxiety to me. But when I hear you guys speak with your encyclopedia knowledge of the legislation and the events that have led us to where we are, I feel better that people like you are hard at work at this. And so thank you on a personal level for doing that. It looks like we have a question from Camille. Do you want to say something before we get out of here, Camille?
I do. First, thank the three of you for the time that you gave us this evening, helping us to get educated on this matter. Jonathan, I did have a couple of questions for you. I won't take up that time tonight because I know we're heading up on an hour, but you did pique my interest in a couple of comments that you made, and I'd like to follow up. What is the best way to do that with you? By a phone conversation, an email?
Yeah, so I will put my phone number and in the chat. So feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email, send me an email. Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. And again, it doesn't matter, like there are multiple organizations. And so whether it is, we work together, and it kind of doesn't matter which color t-shirt you wear. We're all working on the same thing. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So before I end the recording and we formally say goodbye to each other, I would just like to conclude by saying this has been a presentation of the DTC, East Lyme DTC's community conversation, and that the views expressed by the participants do not necessarily reflect the membership of the DTC. I forgot to say that little disclaimer at the beginning. Also, I'd like to invite you all to join us at the next, it's not a community conversation, but the Ledyard DTC has booked Professor Sarah Bronin, who is the guiding force of Desegregate CT. She's going to speak about HB 6107, about equity in zoning laws, and that will be on July 12th, and that will be the Ledyard DTC. Please reach out to them for any information about how to get involved with that. So I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you all for participating. Have a great evening. Happy summer. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.